Okay, this is lecture 4, technically, and it's Leuchtenburg's chapters 5 and 6, and we're going to talk about the 1934 election. So, Franklin Delano Roosevelt elected in 1932. The first 100 days begins in the spring of 1933, continues for 100 days into the summer, and then it ends, right? So this is 1933. This is the 1934 election. The 1934 election is what is known as a midterm election. And there's a truism. Truism is a little bit more true than truthiness, as Stephen Colbert refers to it, but truism means it's generally true, but it's not an absolute law. So there is a truism. The truism is in midterm elections, when the party has won the presidency, then in that midterm election, usually the president loses some seats, right? And it's easy to see why. Become president, you have to make lots of promises. When you become president, it's hard to keep all those promises. So people become disappointed, disenchanted, so they vote for your opponents. And so it's a truism that in the midterm election, the president's party usually loses a few seats. And so this 1934 election is the first election for Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the midterm election. And I titled this election, "Here Comes the Left," because its outcome changes the character of the Roosevelt administration. So I'm going to talk about some extremists and radicals on both sides, so not just the left. And I'm going to talk about them in reverse order of importance, meaning of the three I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to add on a fourth with Upton Sinclair, but the three I'm going to talk about, by far the most important is Huey Long, but I'm going to talk about him third. So in reverse order of importance, we're going to talk about number one, a man by the name of Townsend. Townsend is a public health doctor in California, and he is let go because government cutbacks because of the loss of tax revenue meant that he lost his job in California as a public health doctor, as many people did. So he's sitting in his kitchen and he's looking at his finances, and he sees that he doesn't have a lot of money, and that he's also an older person, an older doctor, and so he doesn't have anything for any potential retirement. And so he thinks, boy, this is something that should have occurred. I should have some sort of pension plan. And he says, and there's a lot of people in the same boat with me. And so this problem of the Great Depression and the problem that he's older and doesn't have an income leads Townsend to come up with a pension scheme, which I call a kooky pension scheme, because it is just that. It's kooky, right? So here's Townsend's plan. Townsend's plan is that every 30 days, every member of the country 65 years and older will get $200 a month. If you have a spouse, both of you get $200 a month. And with this $200 a month, free money from the government, you have some obligations. Obligation number one, you have to spend this money. And you have to spend it before the end of the month. So you can't sock it away in savings. You can't, purchase non-material goods. You have to spend the money. And whatever money is left over at the end of the month goes back to the government. But that's okay, because the next month you get another $200. Okay, so this $200 pension plan, every month you get $200 to spend. You can spend it on a kitchen table. You can spend it on going out to dinner. You can spend it on whatever, right? $200 free and clear for you to spend each month. There's another catch to it. If you are currently employed, you have to quit your job. In order to get this money, you have to quit your job. So you get $200 for being over the age of 65. What is this designed to do according to according to Townsend? It's going to solve the pension problem of the retirement age folks who don't have jobs and don't have prospects and don't have any savings. So they're going to get money. So that's good for them. They're going to have to give up their jobs those who are still working. So that's going to open jobs up for the younger unemployed, which will help them out. And then because you're spending that money every month, it's going to fuel the consumer production community or economy. So people making couches, people making refrigerators, people working in restaurants, all those places, their jobs are going to be stimulated because people are spending this money every month. This is his plan he developed sitting at his kitchen table drinking a cup of coffee, designed to resolve this problem of the Great Depression. There's a problem with this pension plan, and that problem is called math. Because in order to make his plan work, he needs to generate an enormous amount of money, $24 billion. That's a lot of money in 1933. It's a lot of money now, even though we start throwing around the word trillion. So this pension plan by itself would be $24 billion. This comes at a time when the national income is $40 billion, which means just for this pension plan, you're going to have to capture more than half of the income of the rest of the American public. And that means that whatever other things you have to spend money on in tax dollars, you have to fund the government, police forces, fire departments, the military, all the things that you pay for with tax dollars is going to be added on top of that. And then from that, you have to pay for your rent, your own food, and things like that. You're talking about taking more than half the income of the nation to benefit for what at that time was 9% of the population. It simply cannot work, the amount of figures that you're talking about here. Congressmen know that this can't work because they're good at math, or at the very least, they have a staffer who's good at math. So it's clear this pension plan won't work, but it's very popular, particularly in the West, because old folks like it. Old folks like it because they're getting free money. They're not really interested in what the math adds up to be. As they understand it, they're getting retirement money every month for them to spend. Sounds like a good deal to them. And here's a fact that is useful for you to remember come November. Older populations vote in much higher percentages than younger populations like yourself. Because they vote, politicians pay attention to what they want. Even when they know it's not in the best national interest, politicians who are looking for the votes of a large sector of the population who vote every year that there's an election, they're going to cater to the older folks. So Townsend's plan, what does it tell us? It tells us that the people are losing faith in the normal solutions to resolve the Great Depression. So they're left to come up with their own plans, plans that are unworkable, but nonetheless become popular because people want something to happen. The second person I'm going to talk about is Father Coughlin. He's known as the radio Catholic priest. He's a Catholic priest who has a radio show. So Father Coughlin has a radio show. He's based out of Wisconsin, and he's very popular amongst Catholic populations across the middle and upper Midwest. And in his weekly radio chats, Father Coughlin talks about the issues of the Great Depression. And he talks about the evils of banks and how bankers are rigging the system to keep hardworking Americans, like his listeners, in trouble, economic trouble, for their own economic interests. So what does this mean? It means that it's a scheme, it's a plan, it's a plot, it's a conspiracy to keep the nation enmeshed in this Great Depression because bankers are benefiting in Coughlin's interpretation. Now, that in itself is troubling, but then it's further troubling because when Coughlin talks about bankers, many of the bankers' names that he refers to are bankers whose names end in Berg or Stein. Almost enough to lead the casual listener to think that Father Coughlin may be suggesting that Jewish bankers are the ones that are behind this plot. And this would make Father Coughlin anti-Semitic. Well, here's the wonderful thing about being a historian, and what historians do, is that we usually find out. And in this case, we found out how Father Coughlin stood on these topics because while he was very circumspect not to say the Jews when he's on the radio program, in his private correspondence, in letters, in speeches he gave to select groups, he didn't show that sort of reticence. He very clearly said, it's all the damn Jews' fault. This is a classic conspiracy trope, and it's one, tragically, that has been deployed for centuries, in which finding an other, oftentimes Jews, as somebody to blame for these problems. So Father Coughlin is claiming a conspiracy that his listeners understand to mean Jewish bankers, right? So Father Coughlin, also, he's providing a very dark view of why this depression continues to grind on, how we could not emerge from it. But Father Coughlin can't run for office because, one, he's a Catholic priest, and two, he's Canadian. So those two things prevent him from being an elected official having this sort of impact, which brings us to our third character, and by far the most dangerous, a man by the name of Huey Long. Huey Long was a politician from the fine state of Louisiana. He became governor of Louisiana, worked his way up, became governor, and then became United States Senator from the fine state of Louisiana, elected in 1932. And Huey Long, one of the things I really like about Leuchtenburg's book, there's a number of things I really like about it. One thing that I find a bit of a limitation is that we don't have color pictures, and that's pictures from the Great Depression era. There's not too many that are color. So we don't have any color pictures, which is unfortunate because he has a marvelous picture of a perfect Huey Long moment. It's a picture of Huey Long walking in front of the LSU band, and he's leading the band in a parade. And Huey's walking along, and it's a black and white photo, so you can't really tell what he's wearing. He's wearing a white seersucker suit. He's carrying a straw boater that he's swinging around to encourage people. He's wearing saddle shoes, and his tie is a watermelon colored tie. It's marvelous, right? This image is the perfect image of a simple country bumpkin or a rube. That's the persona that Huey Long is seeking to portray. Huey Long's electoral strategy runs along the following lines. He says, I'm a simple man just like you, and I'm working to prevent the sharps and the city slickers and those Harvard-educated corporate attorneys who are seeking to screw you, the little man. So I'm working to protect your interests. I'm just a simple man like yourself who is forced into this role because of the duplicity of big corrupt corporations and big corrupt government. The truth of the matter is, Huey is razor sharp and immensely ambitious. Huey Long is very keenly interested in becoming president. And if he can't be president, then dictator will do. So Huey's a politician who has worked his way up through the political tactics of destruction. He identifies somebody who's an enemy, a cheat, or some such thing that's ripping off the people, and only Huey's there to protect the good, simple folk of Louisiana from these corrupt government officials or judges or whatever, right? So Huey becomes senator from the fine state of Louisiana after an extended period of time as governor of the fine state of Louisiana. And so Huey's interested in becoming president, so he wants to test the water a little bit. But of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's running is president after being elected in 32, which means he'll probably be running for re-election in 36. So Huey's plotting, I'm going to run for president in 1940 after FDR's 2 terms. And so he's calibrating his planning, national planning in that fashion. So Huey comes up with a plan he calls Share Our Wealth, which sounds very homey, right? Who doesn't want to share? It's what they teach you for the first couple days in kindergarten. Share the wealth, right? Share. So Huey comes up with a plan to share, and he says, I know that the wealthy people want to help out their neighbors, right? So they want to do what's right by everybody in these desperate times. They want to share. And what I want to do as Huey Long is to help them share. And here's how he's going to help them share. He says, there's nobody who needs to make more than $350,000 a year, right? $350,000 a year in 1933 money is a lot of money. So people who make that amount of money, they're doing just fine, right? Anything they make above $350,000, why they should share with their fellow American. And to help them share it, I am proposing a share our wealth tax, which will tax any income above $350,000 at 100% rate. Meaning, he's going to confiscate the income of everybody above $350,000. With this money, he's then going to distribute it to the poor folks in the nation who are in desperate straits. He calls his plan, every man a king. Every man should have the opportunity to be a king. And so he's making promises about delivering money to everybody in the nation drawn from this taxation. This is a very radical notion in American history. We do not have elevated rates of taxation was radical at that time, let alone a rate that is confiscatory, meaning taking everything above a certain level, right? So, of course, lots of people, especially people making more than $350,000 a year, are quite alarmed by this. But this is a notion that's very popular with people in impoverished circumstances. So Huey trots this idea out for a test drive at the Iowa State Fair. And the Iowa State crowd goes crazy. They love it. He said afterwards that this was even easier than talking to folks in Louisiana. Right, so this idea of share our wealth takes off. It's popular in Iowa. He goes to the fine city of San Francisco and gives the same talk in a convention center in San Francisco, and they go wild and love it. He goes to the finest city of the land, Philadelphia, and gives this talk, and they love it. And all of a sudden, there's this generation of support for this radical idea of share our wealth. Right, and Huey's political fortunes are buoyed. And Huey begins to think, well, maybe I won't wait till 1940 to run for president. Maybe I'm going to take a run at the presidency in 1936, right? What these all are signs that people are losing faith in the system, and faith in the ability of government to solve those problems, faith in the ability to resolve this economic disaster of the Great Depression, right? I'm going to give you one more example of this. This is our man Upton Sinclair. We saw Mr. Sinclair before, is the author of The Jungle. In 1933, or actually 1934, excuse me, Upton Sinclair is running for the governor of California. And he's running on a program known as EPIC, which stands for End Poverty in California. This EPIC plan is, it's a radical plan, right? And it's not something hidden. Upton Sinclair wrote a book called Epic, and My Plan to End Poverty in California, which I will initiate in the first 100 days of my governorship. There's billboards that advertise Epic. And Upton Sinclair is running for the Democratic nomination. And he wins in a landslide, right? So he becomes the Democratic governor, gubernatorial candidate for the 1934 election in the state of California. So what is he running on? He's running on the following plan. EPIC is a plan that's going to remove California from the market capitalist system. His plan is to turn the farmers who are in desperate circumstances, who can't find anybody to buy their product, and then they don't have any money to purchase the goods they need, right? But they have an abundance of food that they're producing. So what Upton Sinclair suggests is, instead of being small independent farmers who are competing in the marketplace, he's going to turn them into rural communes, collectives who are producing whatever food crop, wheat, corn, grapes, whatever, right? So they're going to be a collective growing this stuff, and they're going to take the stuff they grow and they're going to take it to factories that are manufacturing refrigerators, kitchen tables, cars in California, whatever, right? So they're going to take these products and they're going to barter them. So the people who work in the factories are going to get free food from these rural communes, and in exchange, they will give them free couches or free tables or free manufactured goods, right? So this is going to be a barter system. And to facilitate this barter system, Upton Sinclair says he's going to create a script that is designed to facilitate this exchange. He calls them California bucks. So the farmers will take their agricultural products to a state government warehouse where they will deliver them, and in exchange they will get these California bucks, and these California bucks can then be used to get furniture or whatever, and those people in the factories can exchange their furniture for California bucks to buy grapes or whatever, right? So this is a radical reorganization, and this is not a secret. This is exactly what Upton Sinclair is running on. His electoral success in the Democratic primary, he received such a large number that he outstripped any of the Republican candidates running for the governor's position in their primary. So if you total up all the votes of the Republicans, he received more as a Democrat. So if the election was held that day, Upton Sinclair would have been made governor of California, but that's not how things work. In the primary, the Republican candidate is running against him and pointing out these radical things. And they are assisted, this Republican candidate is assisted by a set of folks who are issuing propaganda about Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair runs as a Democrat, although we know he was a socialist, right, and wins the Democratic primary, but his own party finds his positions too radical, so they undercut his electoral efforts, and so they chip away at it. And one of the groups that's really opposed to this is the movie industry, because they don't want people bringing California bucks to watch a movie, right? They want good hard cash that they can spend in California or Oregon or Georgia, wherever they want. California bucks only have value in California. So the movie industry doesn't want this whole system going because they don't want to get these, what they consider useless California bucks. So they create, in old-time movie houses, they had to change the reels. And so when they were changing the reels, they often had in between movies or during the reel change or prior to the movie or after, they had these things called Movietone news, which were like little miniature newscasts, right? And a standard trope was what's called the man on the street interview, in which a reporter would stop people on the street and ask them, a series of questions about whatever the interests are. So in California, there was a series of these on the men on the street interviews in which they asked people, who are you going to vote for, right, in this California election? And so there were people, they stopped and they asked who they're going to vote for. And then they said, the people who answered, I'm going to vote for Upton Sinclair, they were often appeared to be mentally slow, or they sounded like they were foreigners, like radicals. So someone would say, well, I'm going to vote for Upton Sinclair. He's going to give me free money, right? Or they'd say, well, I'm going to vote for Comrade Sinclair. He's leading the People's Revolution in California, and I support it, right? And then they would stop and ask who's going to vote for the Republican candidate, Frank Marion. And they would be good, upstanding members of society. So a police officer would say, well, I find Upton Sinclair too radical, and I find Frank Merriman's ideas very sensible. Or they'd be, for the protection of my children in the future, I'm going to vote for the Republican, and whatever. So the upshot is everybody who's portrayed, or everybody who is a voter for Upton Sinclair is either intoxicated, mentally deficient, or a sinister Eastern radical, Eastern European radical, I should be more specific, right? And all the people who want to vote for the Republican are good, upstanding men and women from the community, right? The problem with this is everybody in these Movietone interviews were actors. They were portraying the voting public. This was a piece of propaganda which was utilizing the traditional method of delivering news while you're at the movie house, but it was all propaganda. And it's all designed to undercut Upton Sinclair's support, which turned out to be effective because Upton Sinclair did not win the governor position in the 1934 election. Okay. So there's another thing that that is coming together in this 1934 election. This is the emergence of industrial unions. So we need to go back to the first 100 days when we have subclause 7A. Subclause 7A authorizes and protects the rights of workers to form unions. We also have to think about our previous discussion about what type of unions there were in the early 20th century, and that's the craft unions by the American Federation of Labor. The AFL was a continuing increasing portion of the laboring public. So unions get their power from more members. So more and more members are working in the unskilled sector, the industrial sector, which the AFL would not allow in. So the AFL reached the point where they had to make a decision. And what they did was they created a committee whose task it was to go out and try and organize these unskilled laborers and have them as part of the union. Thus is born what's known as the CIO. Initially, it's the Committee of Industrial Workers or Industrial Organization. Later, it's the Congress of Industrial Organization. The CIO begins as a subpart of the AFL, and then they have a falling out with the AFL because the AFL is not interested really in these unskilled workers who tend to be foreigners. So the CIO breaks away and forms its own union known as the Congress of Industrial Organization. And they remain separated until after World War II when they come back together. So you may still see AFL-CIO on some things because the unions have come back together, right? So this is a union of industrial organization. And it's different from the American Federation of Labor in that. And they begin to become an influence or a part of the electoral cycle here in the 1934 election. So the the truism is that presidents suffer a setback in the midterm election. And political watchers were pretty confident in suggesting that the Republicans were going to pick up some seats in Congress. And some were saying they would pick up 8, 10, or even more seats. So there were the expectation that this was going to be a Republican rally after the disastrous 1932 election. That turned out to be incorrect. This was an enormous Democratic victory in the 1934 election. In the House, you have 322 Democrats and only 103 Republicans. In the Senate, there are 69 Democrats and only 25 Republicans. And in addition to that split of 69 and 25, you have 2 farmer labor senators, 1 progressive, and 1 independent. All 4 of those generally voted with the Democrats. Both houses give the president an over 2/3 majority. That means that anything he wants to pass has the immediate support of more than 2/3 of the Congress because they're supporting their Democratic president. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is said to be riding the tiger. And riding the tiger is, I suppose, one of the things I see as my job in these classes is to rehabilitate old phrases. Ride the tiger is an old phrase. What ride the tiger is, it's an old Indian or maybe Chinese phrase. The origin of it is still a little dispute. That roughly says the following. Riding the tiger is very cool because when you get on the back of this great beast and it starts running, everything gets out of its way. Nothing can stop a tiger wherever it's running, right? But the problem is you have to be you always have to be very careful when you dismount because there's a good chance the tiger might turn around and eat you, right? So what does this mean? That means that Franklin Delano Roosevelt has enormous political power. He has an overwhelming majority in both the Senate and the House. But the problem is these Democrats who are elected in 1934, or many of these Democrats who are elected in 1934, are much more radical than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. One of the number of smears of Franklin Delano Roosevelt that go around in political circles in the present day is that they talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt being a radical. He's not a radical, at least certainly not in his early days as president. He was a centrist, but many of the people who were elected were much more radical and much more further left than Franklin Delano Roosevelt was. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt is facing this sort of conundrum. He has a lot of political power, but the people who are in Congress want much more radical action than Franklin Delano Roosevelt has been willing to support thus far. So that brings us to one more small piece here I want to talk about. This is something that, again, I referenced it in the first 100 days, but it's something that comes to greater fruition in the years that follow. This is a public works program, public works programs, plural, because they're usually only authorized for a year, maybe two. And then at the end of that, then they have to be re-upped, right? Again, the logic is a public works program which the government is paying people to do work for the government, hiring the unemployed to work for the government in some fashion, is always seen as a temporary measure. The first one is part of the first 100 days, and it's known as the Civil Works Administration. The Civil Works Administration is different than the other public works programs that follow because it's funded in a much higher rate. So the CWA, as it was known, would hire people at what they called the prevailing rate. So if you were a carpenter in the city of Wichita and prior to the Great Depression you made $5 a day, the CWA hired you at $5 a day. This was an immediate emergency measure because there were so many people who were unemployed. And as they passed this legislation in the first 100 days over the summer of 1933, they wanted to get it in place because they were very fearful that as the winter came on, people who were being thrown out of their houses and couldn't get enough food would be dying on the streets. This would be a disaster. And so to forestall this, they initiated a very large public works program. It reached its peak in January of 1934 when 4.2 million people were working for the CWA. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt was afraid of the costs. This was increasing the debt of the nation, and it was expenditures that he was fearful they were so large. So he has the notion, I'm not really clear where the notion came from, but the notion that people don't starve in the summer. So as the weather warmed, he began to end the program. And sort of a rolling end to the program, beginning first in the South, Florida, Texas, lower reaches of California. As the weather warmed, moving northward, the program came to an end. So by the late spring of 1934, the program had completely ended. So from its peak at 4.2 million, it declined down to nothing. Right, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt shut the program down as soon as he could because it was so expensive. Of those 4.2 million people working, that was not by any stretch the total number of unemployed. But the idea was by hiring this large segment of unemployed, that would give people money that they could then support their friends or families or whatever, right? So one person working would generate money to support other people, and then it would also stimulate the local economy because these people would have money to buy things like shoes or food or whatever, right? So the idea is that this money is going to have multiple benefits. So even though it doesn't cover every single person who's unemployed, it does inject a serious amount of cash into the communities around the nation. This was the most expensive public works program, and none of the programs that were developed years later ever met that. The next one that comes in this 1934 period, because rampant unemployment is still a major problem, as we saw from the first lecture, is the Works Progress Administration. Works Progress Administration is not as large as the CWA, even though the demand is the same, if not greater. So it's never as large. It gets to about 3 million. The Works Progress Administration also goes under, it's reformed under a name of PWA and WPA again. So all of these different iterations that occur, that are reborn throughout the course of this New Deal period, all have some formation of WPA or PWA or something like that. They're never as large. So roughly 10 million people were unemployed under the WPA, and they hired 3 million. And when it hired these 3 million, it hired them at a discount. So if the prevailing wage was $5 a day to be a carpenter in Wichita, they maybe got $3, right? Or $2. So workers on the WPA worked at a discount if they got those jobs, and then they set these places to work building all kinds of stuff, right? All these jobs programs were designed to build things until relatively recently. Wichita had one of the oldest baseball stadiums in the nation until they tore it down to make a parking lot for our new baseball stadium. But that previous stadium was built by the PWA, right? So if you looked on the cornerstone of Lawrence Dumont Stadium, you saw that it was founded by or built by the WPA. It's a jobs program. A lot of post offices were constructed. A lot of schools were constructed. A number of projects putting people to work in some fashion came out of it. And what made this WPA and other programs unusual is it didn't just hire physical labor. They made an effort, a concerted effort, to hire people in the careers that had been shut down. So what does that mean? So Broadway shuts down because it's the Great Depression. Nobody has any money to spend on a Broadway show, right? So that means all the actors, all the stagehands, the directors, the writers, they're all thrown out of work. So the WPA hires them to work for the government. So what do? The playwrights write plays for the government. The government takes these theater troupes and they take them around the country because it's everybody's federal dollars who are paying for it. So they take Broadway shows and bring them to Derby, or they take, these sort of new Broadway plays and they debut them in Beaufort, South Carolina, right? So a lot of these traveling troupes, they're all people who worked on Broadway or in other high-end theater positions, but now they're out of work, so the government hires them to do that work. They hire artists to paint murals, and especially on buildings, murals and buildings. Here in Wichita, it's very odd to me, there's not a lot of post offices. But back east, there's a lot of post offices, and these older post offices, when you go in, you can see on the walls these great murals. They're painted by people who were artists who were funded by the government to paint these things. Even historians were hired to do historians' work. One of those jobs is in archives. Archives are places where you need a lot of work. There's always a lot of paper that needs to be sorted, organized, collated, summarized, put in the boxes. And so the government hired historians who were unemployed or unemployable at that time and put them to work doing government work, including Mr. Leuchtenburg, whose first job as a historian was working for a WPA program. All right, so that's the 1934 election, the midterm election. Next time we will pick up with discussion about the second 100 days, which comes after this election.